those of you who are new, this is the second webinar in a 7-part series which looks at the components of Pratham's Teaching at the Right Level approach. So thank you very, very much for joining us. My name's Ashley and I'm a policy manager at JPAL, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. Today's webinar is going to provide a brief overview of assessment. This is an important component of many Teaching at the Right Level interventions. It's a simple oral assessment tool which has been used to test basic literacy and numeracy skills. So in this webinar, we'll discuss the use of this tool across India and Africa, as well as the role of this tool in many Teaching at the Right Level interventions. Today we're very lucky to have Willem Abadva, the director of the ASSA Center, Hannah Mae Wilson, a program manager at the PAL Network, and Rachel Denister, the executive director at JPAL, and they will all be presenting for us. Before we dive into the presentation, I'd just like to go over some house rules. The presentations will last half an hour, and each presenter will talk for 10 minutes. When they hear a ding noise during the presentation, it'll allow them to know how much time they've spent. So please, if you are a participant, just ignore those noises. After the presentations, we'll have approximately half an hour for questions. So thank you very much to those of you who submitted questions in advance. We have selected some of these questions for this session. If you have questions during the presentation, please enter them into the chat box. And if we have time, we will direct these to the presenters. So without wasting any more time, let's dive into the presentations with Willem, who's going to present on the work of ASSA.
Thank you, Ashley, and hello everyone. This doesn't seem to be working. Oh, there we go. So I'm going to start with telling you about ASSA, which is the Education Report, in particular where it came from, its design, and what impact it's had. So ASSA started in 2005, and for almost a decade before ASSA started, Pratham had been working with children in schools and outside schools. And what we had learned was that while it was easy to get children into school, in terms of adding value, the only way out seemed to be to have an accelerated approach. And in particular, what we saw was that everybody kind of understood the importance of schooling, whether it was parents or policymakers. But this whole idea of learning, nobody was talking about it. And the assumption seemed to be that, for parents especially, we send our kids to school and they will learn what they are supposed to learn there. That link between going to school and learning was kind of assumed. Teachers were following the brief that they were given, complete the curriculum, and schools were not really structured to deal with kids who were falling behind. The tool that became ASSA actually existed, and we were using that for instruction. And what we had found was that it was very, very useful to engage the parents. Now, the reality in rural India is that even today, 50% children have mothers who have never been to school. 25% children are first-generation learners. Both parents have never been to school. And so the simplicity of the tool really brought the problem home, that a mother who had never been to school, when she saw her child struggling to read something that looked like this, got what the issue is, what the problem was. So steps leading up. So, we had a fairly good idea about the learning crisis, but how to communicate it to the rest of the country? Was it only in places that we were working in? So we started talking about kind of scaling this measurement that we were already doing in our programs to a national effort. And so the tools existed. We contacted a bunch of NGOs in Uttar Pradesh, which is the most populous state in India, to participate in a workshop, to go out and actually use this tool to engage with children and see what they can read and what they can't, and that kind of turned out well. 2005 was also a time that in the budget speech, the finance minister that year talks about shifting the focus from inputs, from outlays to outcomes. So it seemed like the right time to kind of ask this question that, okay, we've managed to get our kids into school. Enrollment even in 2005 was in excess of 90%. For the last 5 years, it's been close to 97%. So the next obvious question was, okay, we've got our kids into school. What is it that our kids are learning, or are they learning in school? And that's the question that we asked in 2005. And so there was a thing about, so how do you measure? So what is learning? How do we measure learning outcomes? There was a fair amount of data available on inputs, number of schools, teachers, stuff on infrastructure, and the measurement, actually, this discourse in education, not just in India, but many other places, was, driven by inputs. Inputs are easy to observe. Inputs are easy to define. Inputs are easy to measure. And so the thinking was that if we have enough schools, if we get our children into school, have enough teachers, have enough teaching learning material, this thing that we call learning, however we define it, will kind of automatically happen. And the question that we asked was, okay, so is it happening? And in 2005, there was no data available on learning outcomes in the public domain. So some of the questions that we had to ask and take decisions on was, what do you want to measure? Should we be measuring at grade level? Should we be measuring foundational? Should we have tests for different groups of children? Should we have a sample-based assessment? Should we go to rural areas, urban areas? Should we have a state-level sample? How often should we measure? Once, or often, like government data available every few years? Where should the measurement be done? Should it be done in school? Should it be done at home? And who should be doing this measurement? And so, if the standard learning assessments, if you look at those, standard learning assessments are done at grade level. They're done subject-wise, and they are usually pen and paper tests. They are done in schools, typically by teachers. The measurements that we had in India were not done every year, and certainly the data was not available or in a form that was accessible by all. The data was generated by experts to be used by experts. Now, the ground reality that we were familiar with was that many children were not fluent readers, even older children. Children went to all kinds of schools. They went to government schools, private schools, religious schools. Attendance was, while enrollment was quite high, attendance was irregular. So on any random day that you went to school, even today, there are some states like UP and Bihar where attendance is only 50%. You would miss a lot of children. So the first principle was we wanted to capture all children. And we wanted to start from where children were at. And our experience was that many children did not have the basic reading and basic arithmetic skills. So ASER is a test for all children. It is test foundational reading and arithmetic. It is an oral one-on-one testing with each child, because if a child cannot read, it doesn't make sense to give her a pen and paper test, and it is done in the home so that we can capture all children, regardless of whether they are in school or out of school, whether they attend a religious school or a government school, whether they attend school regularly or irregularly. The next decision was who would do it. Asar is done by ordinary citizens. We have a partnership with local NGOs or a local college or any local institution in every district, and it is done by volunteers. And it is done at the same time every year, so that results are, data is available and can be used to inform policy. So this is the architecture of ASAR. Start from capture all children, start from where children are at, and it is basic. Now, it was possible at that point. A lot of people told us then that, you know, the test is too simple, or everybody can do that. And it was possible that we found that, in which case the tool would have evolved. But the reality is that ASAR has been done every year from 2005 to 2016, other than 2015 where we took a break, and we do not see much change on the ground. So this is just some numbers from the scope of ASAR 2016, which is the most recent ASAR available. ASAR is only done in rural India. We went to about 589 rural districts from about 610. About 17,500 villages were visited, 350,000 households, and about 562,000 children. The reason why the sample size of ASAR is so large is we wanted it to be representative at the district level because education plans are made at the district level. Typically, it's kicked off in August. We are in the field September, October, November, and the report is released like clockwork in the second week of January every year. People involved, about 500 district level organizations, 1,000 master trainers, and about 25,000 volunteers. So what does ASAR tell us? This is the tool of ASAR, which was the tool that we were using for instruction, and this became the reading tool. The tool that you see in front of you is the tool in Hindi. ASAR is done in 21 local languages, so we have 20 similar tools in other regional languages. And the highest level in the ASAR reading test is what we call the story level, which is typically pegged at a grade 2 level text. Now, if you look at the numbers, for grades 3, 5, and 8, only about a fourth of children in grade 3 could read that grade 2 level text in 2016. 50% children in grade 5 could not read that, over 50%. And even in grade 8, about 27% children could not read this grade 2 level text. And these numbers are not very different from where we started in 2005. The situation in arithmetic is not very different. Sorry. So this is the math tool. The highest level in the math tool is a division level, which is typically at about grade 4. And the next level is subtraction, which is 2-digit from 2-digit. You can see that. And so if we look at grade 3, again, about a fourth of children could do that subtraction. In grade 5, 50%. And grade 8, only about 2/3 of children could actually do subtraction, which is at the level of grade 2. And the math numbers, if you look, the math ability actually has come down since 2005. Now, in terms of what does ASER tell us in terms of last 10 years, what have we learned from ASER in the last 10 years? ASER does not track the same children, doesn't go to the same children every year, but we can track artificial cohorts. So if we look at a cohort that started standard grade 3 in 2009, and that's the red line, and compare their performance with a cohort which started standard 3 in the next year, and then the following cohort, what you see is, and so these are the learning trajectories that you see there. What you see is, first, learning levels are low, and they're slow to change. While children learn as they proceed from grade to grade, so the learning trajectories are upward sloping, they are relatively flat. So every year, there is value added, but not as much as one would expect. And finally, that key is really the scariest part of this, is that note that the learning curve for each successive cohort lies below the previous one. What that tells us is that as children are progressing through the school system, the value added for every new cohort is becoming smaller and smaller. So the system is adding less and less for every new cohort. Impact, the fact that ASER is done every year is kind of built into the architecture of ASER. We put annual in our name. ASER stands for the Annual Status of Education Report, and the reason why, when we started doing ASER, we made a commitment to do it for 5 years. When the 4th ASER report was released, we had a consultation with policymakers, academics, other users of ASER data to talk about, what should we morph into, what should we do next, and the consensus was, oh no, you can't stop because there is no other data available on learning, and so we have to do it for another 5 years. And so we did ASER every year from 5 to 14. And I think being there year on year with the same numbers at the same time, I think that really helped us get the traction that we got. So 2008, for the first time, there was a line item in the district annual work plans which talked about allocations for learning enhancement programs. 2011, ASER, the 5-year plan talked about measuring learning in schools. By 13-14, almost all schools would be their state level assessments, and then there have been many states have now embarked on having remedial programs in schools. The ASER results were also used to tie up with partners, and this is what teaching at the right level tying up with government. So the idea here was that in the school, teachers use the ASER tool to do their assessment, and then took children out of the grades that they were in and basically grouped them according to their ability and did instruction in these groups. And that's this whole idea of teaching at the right level, because if like I said, 50% 10 children have...
Willema, if you could just wrap up. I think Ashley's audio didn't come through, but I think your time is just about up. Thank you.
So, grouping children and assessing children on the Assess tool and grouping them has worked fairly well. And so, you know, to conclude, we need for learning assessment data for developing countries needs to be relevant and appropriate for their needs. And therefore, it has to start from where children are rather than where we expect them to be.
Thanks very much, Willema. Can everyone hear me? Hello?
Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you. I'm afraid my bells didn't work so well, but thank you very, very much, Willema, for that. I think if we can move to Hannah May now, who will talk about the work of the TaRL network.
Thanks so much, Ashley. Hi, everyone. My name is Hannah May, and I'll be talking a little bit about the work of the TaRL network, of which Centre is the founding member. So if we can just go to the next slide. Great. So our story sort of starts where Willema's left off, which is the citizen-led assessment approach, as Willema has said, was born in India now 11 years ago, and was really a result of the work that Pratham was doing to understand whether or not children were learning. And the growth of this approach globally has happened relatively organically, and it's really been spurred by the interest and the enthusiasms of citizens in Global South countries to obtain reliable estimates of learning for all children in a settings to inform policy and practice. So I'll talk a little bit about how the network has grown over the last 11 years, and then we'll look a little bit at our key principles, and then a little bit more about how we've contextualized the different tools and tests to suit the contexts of the different countries. If we can move to the next slide. So on this map, you can see that there are 14 countries highlighted, and that's how many countries are in the TaRL network currently in 2017. It hasn't always been this big. The citizen-led assessment approach started in India in 2005, and a couple of years later, a team from Pakistan visited India. They were experiencing similar things in their settings with many more children in school, but they wanted to get a better idea of what the entire picture of learning looks like. And in 2008, they decided to do their own ASA. And the following year, a team from East Africa also visited India for the same reason and decided this would be an approach that would be appropriate for their context. And it's in this way, really, that the network has grown over time. In 2011 and 12, respectively, Mali and Senegal visited India, and that's when their citizen-led assessment started too. So it was around 2012 when the network countries started meeting relatively informally together to discuss opportunities of working together and discuss the challenges in our different contexts. And 3 years later, that's when the TaRL network was born, and we now have a secretariat office which is based in Nairobi in Kenya, and we have 14 countries that are members of the network currently that are in all sorts of different stages of conducting their citizen-led assessment. So we have about 7 or 8 countries who are doing this on a national scale. They have data for the entire country. We have a couple more countries who are just moving from their pilot to their scale-up stage, for example, Nigeria and in Mexico. And we have a few more countries, the most recent countries to join the network, who are still piloting the approach, which, for example, would be Mozambique and Bangladesh. If we can move to the next slide. So, as Willema mentioned, there are a number of key principles that really bind the network together, because we do have a very similar approach, even though we work across very different contexts. And this is something that we agreed upon in 2015 when we founded the TaRL network. What was it that we agreed upon that really brought us together as a group of people conducting citizen-led assessments? What were the key tenets of the assessment that were important to us? And I won't take too long dwelling over these because Willema went through them in the previous presentation, but to mention a few of the most important ones, we conduct our assessments in the household rather than in the school to ensure that a much wider range of children are included in the sample, regardless of their schooling status. conducting the assessment in the household also allows parents and community members to see firsthand that schooling doesn't necessarily mean that their children are learning. And when we conduct these assessments, we conduct them in very, very basic reading and mathematics tests, which are based on national curriculum. And the fact that they're based on the national curriculum in each country is very important, and we'll talk about this a little bit later in the presentation. This allows the assessments to be nationally owned and nationally relevant to inform both policy and practice. The assessments are conducted orally, one-on-one, as you can see in the picture here, which is a picture that was taken in the north of Mali, because pen and paper tests make an assumption that children can already read and write. And we know in the context of our countries that that's not necessarily true, and so we don't make that assumption. The assessments are conducted by citizen volunteers, which allows an enormous amount of normal people to go out and see and understand the learning crisis firsthand, and to also organise and think of what solutions they can come together to implement in their own local context. And lastly, our findings are communicated simply and visually, because we know that in many of the countries that we work in, there isn't an established practice of using very complex results to inform both policy and practice. And we want, as Willema said, our data to be very actionable and very easy to understand, not just for those at the policy level, but for ordinary citizens all over the country. So if we move to the next slide, you can see on the next slide our history in numbers very briefly. So across the network, we've been in action for 11 years in a number of countries. We are working across 3 continents. We have recruited and trained over 600,000 volunteers. We have conducted over 48 assessments. We conduct those assessments in over 30 languages. And in total, over the years that we've been conducting citizen-led assessments across the various countries, we have assessed more than 7.5 million children. So as each new country has understudied the citizen-led assessment model, they have adapted the survey tools and tests to their national context. And it's very important to reiterate again that citizen-led assessments never set out to be an internationally comparable metric of learning, but it set out to be nationally owned and nationally relevant and a regular snapshot of what children in that country can do. And so whilst the citizen-led assessment countries agree on a set of core principles, which I mentioned in the previous slide, the process of executing the citizen-led assessment, it happens slightly differently in each country, and that's what we'll look at for the next couple of minutes. If we move to the next slide. In Willema's presentation, she showed you a test that was in Hindi language, which is used in India, and India tests in over 20 languages. And the one that you see on the screen currently is in the Hausa language from Learn Nigeria. And the first thing that you'll notice is that although in different languages, the tests themselves and their presentation look quite similar, and they look very simple. And the tests are designed deliberately like this to enable a wide range of people to understand how the assessment works, especially for adults, parents and guardians who might not have learned how to read. The test is very easy to follow, and a parent can easily and quickly diagnose when and where a child is struggling. So this is a very important component of the citizen-led assessment model, is the apparent simplicity of the assessment on the front end, which enables lots of people to understand and get involved, is backed up by a very sophisticated back end, which actually underlies a lot of complex processes and involves a lot of different experts in the design and the execution of these assessments. So if we take test development as an example of that, every country will have their own test development framework for the creation of the tests to guide how that is done and who should be involved in the design and the creation of those tests. And then secondly, each country will have a panel of experts which is convened to develop the tests. And these panels usually include representatives from the Ministry of Education, subject specialists, curriculum experts, academics, practicing teachers, and others as well. And if we just move to the next slide. So one of the things we wanted to talk mainly about in this presentation was how the tests and tools have been adapted across the different countries to suit the local context and the local culture. And in terms of developing the tests, there are 3 really important guidelines for creating new tests. for each country that starts the citizen-led assessment process. And the first is that all tests have to adhere to the national curriculum of that country. The tests are designed according to the national curricular expectations of grade 2 level. And that's because it's thought that by grade 2, children should have the foundational skills and competencies that are the building blocks for all of their future progress. And without those, it's very difficult to make progress in school and in life as well. The other important guideline for the development of the tests to sort of guide how many are created and in what language they're created is, what does the national policy say about the language of instruction? So, for example, is mother tongue instruction something which is within the language policy of the country? If there is no policy on mother tongue instruction, the tests will only be designed in the national language, for example. If the country has a mother tongue policy, there needs to be instructional materials that are developed in that language to enable those tests to be developed. So that means, in other terms, the written language must be familiar to the children that are being assessed. So if we use Kenya as an example, which is where the Secretariat is based, mother tongue language is the language of instruction up to grade 3. However, there are no instructional materials used in the classroom from which the tests can be designed. And that sort of is going into a little bit of detail about the decisions that are made about what languages will be tested in the literacy assessment. And the third most important thing in the creation of new tests is really relevance to the context. So in the higher levels of the grade 2 tests, we have very short paragraphs and short stories that are developed, and they must be familiar to the child. You can't, for example, translate and adapt a short story that's used in India to use in Mali, because you lose the meaning and context in translation. So to sum up this slide, the tests must be developed independently of each other and verified to ensure that they meet the national curriculum expectations and they haven't been directly translated from another country. And if we just go to the next slide.
Hannah May, you have about 1 minute left.
Okay, great, thanks. So the next slide will just show a sample of some of the countries within the network. And this shows how many children in grade 5 are able to read the grade 2 test in literacy and the grade 2 test in numeracy. So when the citizen-led assessment first started, the information on poor learning levels was enough to start a national debate and a conversation, putting pressure on governments to discuss and revisit policy, curriculum expectations, and classroom practices. However, as time's gone by and more countries have started conducting the citizen-led assessments, the fact that children are in school and not learning is no longer new information. So at the point we are in the network now is we are asking the question, so what's next? So if we go to the final slide. So the aim of citizen-led assessment has always been to bring learning to the centre of not just policy, but practice as well. Using the assessment data to inform action or intervention programmes across the network has happened in different ways, at different levels, and at different points in the process. Yet, our name is People's Action for Learning, so the assessment is just one action in a long line of different actions and activities that will ultimately lead to improved learning outcomes for all children, and this is something that the majority of the countries within the TaRL network are now experimenting with, is actually what's next after the assessment question. As Willem has stressed, it's really important that this data is relevant and appropriate, not just for providing monitoring information, but it's actionable. And so teaching at the right level is just one such action which has evolved directly from the assessment and uses the assessment regularly to monitor learning progress for children that haven't acquired those basic skills. And if we just move to the final slide, I've projected some things in this presentation, including the tests and the results from citizen-led assessments that are all available on the TaRL Network website. If you go to tarlnetwork.org, then all of our tests and survey materials, as well as some of the results, are all open access for people to interact with and download. And my email address is also there should anyone need any further information. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Hannah May. I think we can move to Rachel's presentation now.
Great. Thanks, everyone. I just want to talk briefly about what some of the research is saying about the value of assessments and how they can and cannot contribute to learning, addressing the problems we've been hearing about the learning crisis. And I think briefly to sum up, poor assessments have been part of the problem that may have been causing some of the learning crisis. Assessments on their own aren't sufficient to solve this, but used appropriately with other measures, they can be part of the solution. So, as they say, a lot of countries have these very high stakes assessments, often at the end of primary school, which are very high level in the sense that only a relatively small proportion of the population may pass them, or certainly a large proportion, maybe 25 to 50% of the population may not pass them. But then schools and teachers are evaluated by how many of their kids they can get through these assessments. So, in West Africa, there's these high stakes end of school leaving exams. Similarly, in Kenya and Uganda, I know Africa better than India, but there's a similar approach in India that people see education as about getting people through these kind of high stakes exams. And the problem with that is that if you just reward people who get the high marks on these tests, there's no reward for getting kids from the low, from performing at a low level to a slightly better level. There's no really reward in getting, improving from single-digit addition to double-digit addition. It's only if, you can perform really well on geography and history that, you do your school proud. And that kind of sets up completely the wrong incentives for teachers and students. So if assessments are part of the problem, can they also be part of the solution? Well, I want to just refer to, everyone's been talking about teaching at the right level, particularly Willema, and I just want to briefly say that, there's a lot of research now about some of the most effective ways to improve learning have involved teaching at the right level. This is, everything from evidence in Kenya that textbooks only improve learning if for those who are at the level of the textbook, which was only the top of the class, that splitting class by learning levels improve learning, remedial education programs, including those run by Pratham, help those falling behind, and then in a big review we just completed of what works in education technology, really what comes through very clearly in this is that education technology works pretty much only or best when it helps target teaching to the level of the child. And this is just part of that review paper showing all the studies that have looked at personalized learning outcomes on math scores. And you see these very impressive gains. So, are you having problems with the slide?
Yeah.
Oh dear. Hopefully, if you haven't seen the original slides, you can see them afterwards. We'll circulate them. So, kind of how could assessment be part of the solution? Well, we have a nice theory of change, which you'll hopefully see in a minute, which is that, maybe assessments could be used providing information on learning levels to teachers, and then teachers could be equipped and understand the level of learning in the classroom and better target their effort to, target their teaching to the level of the children in the class, because maybe before they didn't really understand kind of quite how low the level of learning was. They just talk to the kids who put their hands up and have the answers, and so they get the wrong impression of so that's one idea. The other possible way in which assessments could help improve learning is if we can get the incentives better, by doing assessments that are better tailored to the level of the child, then teachers could, are better incentivized to worry about the kids at the bottom. So people have actually tried to research this and test whether providing assessments on their own to teachers changes teaching behavior. And there was one study which was in India, which was part of kind of a study that looked at many different things. But in one of them, there was feedback to teachers based on assessments about where the kids in the class were, and an announcement of tests at the end that would be much more, wouldn't be these only testing the top, but testing the whole range of learning amongst kids. And while teachers changed their behavior when they were being observed when they were given this assessment, there was actually no improvement in test scores, and we think that was probably because they were only changing their behavior when they were being observed. So in another randomized trial, there was, again in India, there was an attempt to provide the kind of comprehensive continuous assessment that is done by Pratham in its teaching at the right level work, and again kind of feeding to teachers where children were, and again, and then there was another arm that used those assessments to sort children, and kind of also changed the way that teachers taught based on the assessment. So they were grouped children. The assessment was used to group children into appropriate levels of learning, and it was only when the assessment was used to then group children that you had any improvements in learning. So the lessons for this is that you need both the assessment and changes in pedagogy. You need to actually do something with the assessment if you're going to change how teachers teach in a way that changes learning. So, and I'd add, we also looked at, in another program in India, we looked at just providing assessments to the local communities, and again, just that on its own wasn't effective, but if you gave communities those assessments and a way in which they could respond to them and do something about learning in their communities, then it was very effective. I've talked a lot about India, so I wanted to add in an African example. This was kind of pre-ATA, but in a sense, a similar kind of approach, which was in Kenya, where they had additional teachers, because they had these massive increases in number of kids going to the schools. They raised the money to find an additional teacher so they could split the classes into two, and they tried in some cases just splitting the classes, with kids allocated randomly. And in another case, they split the kids based on how much they knew coming into school. So this is particularly important because the teaching is in English, and a lot of kids coming in knew no English, but some kids knew some English. So they used these assessments which was basically how much English do you know, to split the kids and into different classes. And there you did find that teachers changed how they taught because they knew they were, this is a class where the kids know no English, and they use more mother tongue. And we see improvements in both classes, both the top streamed and the children who didn't know English coming into the classes. So, and then our final example of where assessments can be used to change learning is, the Pratham teaching at the right level example, where you use the quick ATA assessment to regroup children into levels, and then you assess again. I think this is really important. The teacher then assesses so that as soon as a child has mastered the skill, they move on to the next group. So you're not kind of stuck in the bottom group forever. If you improve, you move up to the next group. And we've been looking at this, using this approach that Pratham has used in India so successfully in other countries, and I'd encourage all the PAL network to think about this. So what are the insights? What children are assessed on and when they're assessed can create incentives in the system which can either push teachers to teach just to the top of the class or to teach to, the whole distribution of kids. It can, just giving teachers learning level information on its own may not be enough to change what they do or improve learning outcomes. But learning assessments are a really important way to, when combined with sorting classes by learning levels, can lead to very dramatic improvements in learning. Thank you. Anyone here?
Okay, so thank you very much to all of our presenters. I think there's some connection issues with WebEx, so our apologies for the technical difficulties. But as Rachel mentioned, we'll definitely send out the recording as well as the presentation slides, so you can refer to that after. Just a quick reminder, if you're not on mute, to please go ahead and do that so everyone can hear. For the last 15 or so minutes, we'll go ahead and answer some of the questions that were submitted by everyone who registered. And so the first question is for Willema. This person would like to know, how does the USER reading tool compare with other assessment tools, such as EGRA, and what are the benefits of using one versus the other? It's possible that we have lost Willema. Hannah Mae, are you still on the line? Okay. So it sounds like we may unfortunately have lost connection with both Hannah Mae and Willema. We do have a couple of questions for Rachel, which we can address at least. So how do you address the issues of large class sizes, lack of resources, and underqualified teachers when you plan for assessment-driven action?
So under-resourced schools is obviously a major issue in many developing countries. It's actually, there's been a lot of testing as to whether simply providing additional resources in terms of more textbooks, more teachers, which gets to your second question about large class sizes. Simply reducing class size, simply providing more input on its own has been tested a number of times and has not improved learning at all. Now, I don't want to say inputs aren't useful at all, because many of the programs that changed the way we teach involved using input. So if you look at what Pratham does, part of what they do is provide appropriate level reading material in order to be able to get people to focus on reading. Instead of these dense textbooks with lots of complicated words, they provide these simple books so people can, practice reading simple sentences. Although they also use very low touch. I've seen people using pieces of paper, cutting them up and writing letters on them, and then the kids arrange them. So it's actually, I think, yes, there are low resources, but I don't think that's the main problem. Again, class sizes, the issue isn't so much the size of the class, because if you just reduce the class size and do nothing else, then that doesn't improve learning. But some of the tools for teaching at the right level involve kind of splitting them up into small groups to work, and that may need additional help. It's actually amazing how much you can do with very poorly trained teachers. We tested the Pratham model in Uttar Pradesh with volunteers who were trained for a couple of weeks, and they improved learning more in 3 months than the schools had in an entire year. So I think this becomes more of a problem as we go up to higher grades within schools, because then if you haven't mastered the material, it's very hard to teach it, and there's some very good data coming out of the World Bank showing that, you know, a lot of teachers don't know the material they're meant to be teaching. But if we're focused at this early grade reading, early grade math, basic skills, you actually don't need very well trained teachers in order to you know, get those basics across. What you need is to change the way we teach and to focus on basic skills.
Perfect. Thank you, Rachel. So we have one additional question for you, and then I think we can kind of wrap up. So this question is about kind of informing parents and communities about the learning levels of their children or other children kind of in that community. And what is your sense, or what does the evidence tell us about the effectiveness of doing that in terms of kind of leading to action or change?
Yeah, I think there's not a huge amount of evidence on this. What there is not very encouraging. We were involved in a study in India where Pratham was doing these asset tests and then providing them to the community. And I think part of the issue that you have to think about here is the community is only one level of pressure. And a lot of the people in these communities have very little power. They're less educated than the local teacher. They have less status than the local teacher. It's very hard for them on their own to put pressure. Some amazing people will do, but to expect, you know, poor illiterate families always to be able to successfully put pressure on a large scale is, I think, asking a lot. I think what I like about ASA is it's not just about the communities. It's the communities and every layer of the political system all the way up. So what we were looking at is just some communities got the information, some communities don't. But ASA is now this big program where you give information to communities and district heads and state officials, and I've been, you know, with the chief minister in a state the day before the ASA results came out, and there was lots of, you know, toing and froing and panic about was their state going to go up or down in the hierarchy. And so I'm a great believer of information, but it's got to go to the powerful and the less powerful. And there may be some kind of benefits to many, many people seeing it, so you can put pressure at lots of different levels. Only expecting communities on their own to change the world is kind of maybe asking